On Thursday, July 18, 1946, the summer heat in Greenwood, South Carolina, hung heavy in the air as Margaret Maggie Johnson stepped out of Miller's General Store with a small paper bag of groceries pressed against her chest. At 73 years old, she moved slowly, carefully, each step supported by a worn wooden cane polished smooth by decades of use. She had lived in Greenwood her entire life, born in 1873 when the wounds of the Civil War were still fresh. She had survived Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars without ever leaving this town. Margaret was not known as a troublemaker, nor as someone who challenged the racial order. She was quiet, polite, and cautious, a woman who understood exactly how dangerous the world could be for someone like her. All she wanted that afternoon was to walk home safely. Margaret lived alone in a small house on Cedar Street, the same house where she had raised her children and later her grandchildren. Her husband had died of pneumonia in 1929, and her daughter, the mother of her beloved grandson Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, had passed away years earlier. After her daughter's death, Margaret had taken in young Bumpy and raised him through his most difficult years. She had taught him to read, to think, and to survive in a world that showed black boys little mercy. Though Bumpy later became one of the most feared figures in Harlem, to Margaret he was still the boy she had tucked into bed and prayed over at night. She loved him without conditions or judgment. In return, Bumpy treated her as sacred, sending money every month and visiting whenever he could. That afternoon, as Margaret walked past the Greenwood Women's Social Club, her eyesight failed her for just a moment. She accidentally brushed against a white woman standing on the sidewalk, Nina Pritchard, the wife of a deputy sheriff and a well-known racist in town. The contact was slight, barely noticeable, but Margaret immediately stopped and apologized. Her voice was soft, respectful, trained by decades of survival. She explained that she hadn't seen the woman and begged forgiveness. In 1946 South Carolina, apologies were often the difference between walking away and never walking again. Margaret meant no harm, no disrespect, and only wanted to go home. Nina Pritchard reacted with explosive fury. She screamed loudly, drawing attention from people up and down Main Street. She accused Margaret of touching her on purpose, of forgetting her place, of daring to lay hands on a white woman. Margaret's fear deepened as heads turned and footsteps slowed. She apologized again, her voice trembling now, explaining that she was old and meant no offense. But Nina wasn't interested in apologies. She wanted a performance, a public reminder of power. Her voice carried authority, not because she was right, but because she was white in a town built on racial terror. Within seconds, 3 other white women stepped forward, all members of the same social club and all wives of influential men. Together, they surrounded Margaret, cutting off her path. The situation escalated quickly, words turning into shoves, insults becoming threats. Margaret clutched her groceries, her cane shaking in her hand. She pleaded to be allowed to leave, promising again and again that it was an accident. But the 4 women had already decided that this elderly black woman would be their lesson, their demonstration of dominance. They dragged Margaret into a narrow alley between a bank and a hardware store, away from the main street and away from anyone who might intervene. The beating began almost immediately. Slaps echoed off brick walls. Fists struck her fragile body. She fell hard to the ground, her groceries spilling into the dirt, eggs cracking, milk soaking into the dust. Her cane was knocked out of reach. Margaret tried to shield her face, but her strength was no match for 4 women decades younger. She cried and begged, her voice growing weaker with every blow. A black man named Thomas Washington heard the noise from behind the hardware store. When he looked out and saw an elderly woman being beaten, his instinct was to help. He took a step forward and shouted for them to stop. One of the women turned on him with pure hatred, threatening him with the same fate if he interfered. Thomas froze. He knew the rules of the South. A black man defending a black woman from white attackers meant death, not just for him, but for his entire family. He stood there helpless, tears streaming down his face, watching something inside him break. For 11 long minutes the beating continued. Margaret's breathing became shallow, her face swelled, her ribs cracked under repeated blows. Then Nina made a decision that would change everything. She said they needed to teach all of them a lesson, words heavy with hatred. Rope was demanded. A white store owner provided it without hesitation, knowing refusal would put his own life at risk. The women dragged Margaret toward a large oak tree at the end of the alley. She was barely conscious now, her body exhausted, unable to resist. They fashioned a noose with practiced cruelty and placed it around Margaret's neck. At 2:52 p.m., they hanged her. Her small body struggled weakly for a moments before going still. Margaret Johnson died slowly, strangled beneath the Carolina sun, while the world around her carried on. The women stepped back, laughed, and admired what they had done. They left her body hanging and returned to Main Street, resuming their shopping as if they had merely finished an errand. In Greenwood, this kind of violence was expected to carry no consequences at all. At 3:15 p.m., Thomas Washington did something unimaginably brave. He left the hardware store, found a phone at a black-owned barber shop, and made a long-distance call to New York City. His voice shook as he spoke, terrified of being discovered. He told the operator he needed Harlem. He didn't know Bumpy Johnson personally, but he knew who Margaret was to him. He knew that if anyone in the world needed to hear what had happened, it was Bumpy Johnson. And once that call was made, nothing in Greenwood would ever be the same again. The call from Greenwood reached Harlem after being passed through multiple operators, each transfer stretching Thomas Washington's nerves thinner. When Marcus Webb finally answered, Thomas spoke quickly, afraid someone might overhear him. He described everything in broken sentences: the accidental bump, the beating, the rope, the hanging, the laughter afterward. He gave names, locations, times. Marcus listened without interrupting, his voice calm in a way that was deeply unsettling. When Thomas finished, Marcus told him to stay by the phone and speak to no one else. Within minutes, Marcus placed a second call, this one directly to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's apartment in Harlem, where Bumpy was eating a quiet dinner, unaware that his world had just ended. Bumpy listened in absolute silence as Marcus delivered the news. The silence stretched so long Marcus wondered if the line had gone dead. Bumpy did not cry, he did not shout. His grief collapsed inward, compressed into something cold and lethal. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and precise. He asked for the names again and wrote each one down carefully. Then he gave his order. All 4 women were to be dead before sunrise. Their bodies were to be placed in trash bags and dumped publicly. No discussion, no delays. The calm certainty in his voice left no room for interpretation. This was not rage, it was resolution. Marcus tried to explain the distance, the difficulty, the time constraints. Greenwood was hundreds of miles away. Bumpy cut him off. Logistics did not matter, results did. He told Marcus to call in every favor south of the Mason-Dixon line, to spend whatever money was necessary, and to make sure the message was unmistakable. His grandmother had been 73 years old, frail and harmless. They had killed her and laughed. Now they would learn what it meant to cross the wrong line. When Bumpy hung up the phone, Marcus immediately began making calls, knowing that the clock was already ticking. By late afternoon, Marcus reached Antoine Tony Bogard, a powerful criminal figure in South Carolina who owed Bumpy multiple favors. When Marcus explained what had happened, Tony did not hesitate. He understood immediately what this meant, not just emotionally, but symbolically. Lynching had been treated as consequence-free for generations. This response would change that. Tony began assembling a team, calling men he trusted absolutely, men with military backgrounds and criminal experience, men who could move fast and leave nothing behind. Within an hour, 4 operatives were confirmed, briefed, and on the road. As evening fell, the team drove toward Greenwood, keeping their movements quiet and unremarkable. They arrived after dark, parked on the outskirts of town, and observed their targets from a distance. Each woman was home, comfortable, unaware, protected by the false certainty that their actions carried no risk. The team moved with discipline, striking each house methodically. Locks were picked cleanly, sedatives were used to avoid noise or struggle. Each woman was removed from her home in under 2 minutes, leaving no signs of forced entry and no witnesses who could later speak. By shortly after midnight, all 4 women were secured in an abandoned barn outside town. They regained consciousness slowly, confusion turning into terror as they realized where they were. Their hands were bound, their mouths gagged. They tried to plead, to explain, to bargain, but no one listened. The team leader explained why they were there, speaking calmly, almost gently. He told them who Margaret Johnson was. He told them who her grandson was. He told them that this was the consequence of what they had done. The executions were swift, 1 shot each, no hesitation, no cruelty beyond what was required. In less than a minute it was over. The team worked efficiently, placing each body into heavy-duty trash bags, sealing them carefully. They loaded the bags into their vehicle and drove back into Greenwood under cover of darkness. The streets were empty, silent. They placed the bags directly on Main Street, in front of the Women's Social Club, where they could not be missed. Then they left town, disappearing before dawn. When Greenwood woke the next morning, the discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through the community. Police arrived quickly, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence. The message was clear to everyone, even if no one said it aloud. This was not random violence. This was retaliation. This was power answering power. And from that morning forward, the rules in Greenwood, and far beyond it, were no longer quite the same. By mid-morning on Friday, Greenwood was drowning in fear and confusion. The same town that had shrugged off the lynching of an elderly black woman now found itself staring at 4 dead white women, their bodies discarded like refuse in plain sight. People whispered in doorways and storefronts, careful not to speak too loudly. Everyone understood the sequence of tease, even if no one dared say it openly. Margaret Johnson had been murdered without consequence, and within hours, an invisible hand had answered in a way the law never would. This was not justice as the courts defined it. This was something colder, faster, and terrifyingly efficient. Greenwood had lived by unwritten rules for generations, and overnight those rules had changed. Sheriff William Hartwell began an investigation because he had to, not because he believed it would go anywhere. He interviewed neighbors, examined the houses, and reviewed timelines. Everything pointed to a professional operation. No forced entry, no witnesses, no evidence left behind. Within hours, Hartwell learned that Margaret Johnson was the grandmother of Bumpy Johnson. That single fact explained everything. Hartwell had heard the name before, whispered among lawmen and criminals alike. He knew enough to understand that this case was far bigger than Greenwood. This wasn't a local crime. This was a message sent from a man with reach, money, and a network that ignored state lines. The FBI became involved briefly, more out of obligation than expectation. Special Agent Robert Morrison reviewed the case and came to the same conclusion as Hartwell. Whoever had done this was already gone, scattered, untraceable. There would be no arrests, no trials, no answers. Morrison warned Hartwell quietly that pushing too hard could invite consequences Greenwood was not prepared to face. The case was officially LED unsolved. Files were closed. The town was left with its fear and its questions. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never arrive for the 4 women or for Margaret Johnson. But something else had already settled into place. Margaret Johnson was buried on Sunday, July 21, 1946. The funeral was small, attended mostly by members of the black community who understood both her life and her death all too well. Bumpy Johnson stood at the graveside in a tailored black suit, silent and unmoving. He did not cry in public. He did not speak. Those who saw him later said his face looked carved from stone. After the service, when only a few remained, Marcus Webb asked him if he felt any satisfaction. Bumpy's answer was simple. He said satisfaction had nothing to do with it. His grandmother was still dead. Nothing could balance that loss. What Bumpy had done was not about rage alone. It was about boundaries. In a world where black lives were treated as disposable, he had drawn a line and enforced it with absolute clarity. Margaret Johnson had been small, elderly, and harmless, but she had been loved. That love carried weight. The message sent through Greenwood spread quietly across the South and into the North. There were still lynchings, there was still terror. But criminals, lawmen, and even white supremacists understood something new. Some families were connected to power that did not ask permission or wait for courts. The families of the 4 women buried their dead in Greenwood's White Cemetery. Their grief was real, their confusion genuine. They never received explanations, never saw arrests, never found closure. Officially, the murders remained a mystery. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. The silence that followed was heavy, enforced not by law, but by fear. Greenwood returned to routine, but it was a different routine now, one marked by caution and unspoken understanding. As for Bumpy Johnson, he returned to Harlem and continued his life exactly as before. He did not boast, he did not speak publicly about what had happened. Those closest to him knew never to mention Margaret's name lightly. She remained his anchor, his moral center, the one person whose loss he never truly recovered from. In his world, violence was business. What happened in Greenwood was personal. Years later, people would argue whether what happened was right or wrong. Some would call it revenge, others would call it justice. But those arguments missed the point. In 1946 America, Margaret Johnson had no protection. The law did not value her life. Society did not mourn her death. The only thing that responded was power, raw and undeniable. That response did not heal the wound, but it ensured it was not ignored. Margaret Johnson's name did not appear in history books. She was not a leader or a revolutionary. She was a grandmother walking home with groceries. Her story matters because it exposes the brutal mathematics of that era. A black life could be taken casually, publicly, without consequence. But when that life was connected to someone who could act, the equation changed. Not because the system became fair, but because fear finally flowed in both directions. After July 1946, no one ever touched Bumpy Johnson's family again. Not in Greenwood, not anywhere else. The message had been delivered, received, and understood. And though Margaret Johnson never lived to see it, her death marked the moment when one small, overlooked life forced a reckoning that an entire town would never forget.